So welcome. This is our first web workshop. Hopefully there will be more people in future editions. I'm planning on trying to schedule more collaboratively next time so that hopefully we don't overlap with stuff like the conferences. But so what I'm actually thinking of is doing this as a series of 3 workshops, each of which is focused around a related technology. So today we're talking about HTML. We'll be talking about a flavor called XHTML specifically. I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But the idea here is that there's a series of workshops where what I'm intending to do is to give people the kind of basic skills to develop relatively simple static websites. And this is focused in terms of building a website for a course that you're teaching or a section that you're a TA for. So to give you an example, I'll show you my own current section website that I built over the course of last quarter for Professor Newfield's course on detective fiction. Which, if you take a look at it, you will notice that I am not a fantastic designer. But the idea here is that there's a number of documents that are useful for students grouped into sections. You have a syllabus, you have the professor's own course website, you have a bunch of documents that I hand out in class, right? So I always develop a version of my section guidelines handout, my grading rubrics. I have a tendency to develop a document at the end, by the end of every quarter called How Your Grade is Calculated in excruciating detail, because that helps avoid grade disputes. And a lot of my intention here is not just to make it possible. I'm just checking to make sure everything looks okay on the screen too. Not just to make it possible to point at the documents on the website later and say, I told you so, although that absolutely always winds up happening with at least a few students every quarter. But also, because I think that giving students clear and explicit expectations in advance is a good way to kind of ameliorate the anxiety so that you can actually do some teaching instead of dealing with administrative crap all the time in section. So, and then there's a variety of other things that I tend to point out. With any course that has any kind of research-based paper expectations, I always put in this stuff, which is a set of useful links to how do I do research, because you always have that student who says, I don't know how to find articles on books that I've read. And then I tend to post my own discussion notes for every week, so that, again, if a student, maybe I should quit my chat client so I quit getting these pop-up bubbles. So for students who miss, I don't have to write a bunch of emails 3 or 4 a week saying, here's what you missed, it's go look at the section website. So again, a little bit of extra effort, especially the first quarter that you do this, will translate into less total work in the long term. And especially because I tend to use each quarter's section website as a sort of set of templates for the next quarters. So yes, there's a fair amount of work at the beginning, but it's not hard work, and it's not particularly onerous, and it does pay off in the long run. So what I want to talk about is not just how do you build this section website, but also how do you do a good job of it, and how do you make it so that it kind of makes your teaching practices visible on the web, because everybody who is in this room is going to be looking for a job, and possibly a number of people who are not in the room, and that having a set of documents that you can point to that say this is who I am as an instructor is a useful kind of presence management tool. So in terms of what we're actually doing today, what I'm going to be doing is talking about how do you learn this language HTML, which is not in any way complicated. It's actually ridiculously simple, and the fact that there are platforms whose primary advantage is that you don't have to do that is ridiculous. And so I want to also talk about the kind of assumptions that HTML makes in terms of what your content is structured like, and how you can build a website that's easily understood both by various browsers, right? And again, one of the myths that promulgates outside of the web development community about web development is that it's very hard to deal with how different browsers handle your documents. And that's absolutely not true. It gets increasingly true as you move away from standards and as you try to do very complicated things. But I'm not going to be teaching you how to do very complicated things, because I don't think it's necessary to do things like this, right? And again, I want to say I think this is a perfectly adequate website that does a lot for students. It's not necessary to follow every intermittently trendy trend. And also I want to do this in order to help build skills that that I'm going to leverage in future workshops, because I'm not always going to get down to the details of why do I recommend this practice today, but a lot of what I'm recommending is things that will pay off later. And also I want to talk about how do you actually begin constructing a website. So the other side of the coin is I'm going to be moving rather quickly today. What I want for people to understand is not every little detail, nor do I expect that you will necessarily write down all the details, because there's all kinds of places, as you might expect. The web is full of documents about how the web is built. There's lots of great references. I'll put this presentation online if you want to follow back over later. And so what's important is that you pick up major concepts and work with them. If you have questions, or if you're in the process of building a website for your course or section and you run into problems, that's absolutely an appropriate thing that you can come talk to me about during my lead TA office hours. And if you want to write down one URL so that you're not writing down URLs throughout the presentation, here's a short link to a collection of documents that I've built down here. And again, jump in and ask if you have questions. So I talked about this a little bit. What are overall reasons why you might want to have a course or section website? Because you can have copies of handouts that you've put out, right? I always develop, at the very least, a section website that includes my own notes and any kind of policy documents that I hand out, so that I'm not always carrying around a new copy of my section guidelines handout all quarter in case somebody spills beer on it, or my grading rubric, or any of those other things. And again, it helps to make your teaching practices easily visible on the web. And this is one thing that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on as I apply for jobs and awards, is, you know, just having a footnote in that statement of purpose that's 2 pages long saying, if you want to look at more information about who I am as a teacher, here's a link to where you can do so easily. And it helps to link your teaching practices to your online identity. And increasingly, as the world moves more of its information and identity presentation online, it's important to have a sort of a central hub where you can point to a particular place and say, this is who I am. And then, you know, from there you can link to your profiles on academia.edu, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter, whatever it might be that you have as an online identity can be linked to from this. But what I want to conceptualize, the way that I want to conceptualize this is in terms of having a central place where people can primarily go to for information about you. And one of the things that we'll be talking about intermittently today, and also in the third workshop, is how do you make this a sort of a central place that, say, search engines like Google see as the best place to pop up as a top result for people who are looking for information about you. One of the series of questions that I've gotten when I've been talking to people about this initially is people say things like, why should I do this way, right? Why shouldn't I just have, say, a blog on WordPress or Drupal or Tumblr? Tumblr is actually not a bad place to go for quickly building a small website. And there's a number of reasons I want to talk about there. I guess the thing to realize is that there's always some downside to whatever it is that whatever course you take, there's always some downside to it. I think that building a website from scratch with HTML and its related technology, CSS, which we'll talk about in our next workshop, is, you know, it's not a perfect solution, but it is a good one for a number of reasons. And again, I'll be talking about what those reasons are throughout the series of workshops. But what are the downsides? You have to learn HTML. Again, not hard. There's 3 major concepts and a number of details that you need to learn. You have to see your content in a non-word processing based way, and I'm going to say this in various ways over and over throughout today primarily, but also the rest of the workshops. And that is, when you're typing a term paper, say, you tend to think about it presentationally, right? You need to produce a certain number of pages. You need to have certain margin sizes. You need to, you know, think not about what the structure of your text is, but about how it looks on the page. You're not thinking about marking something as a book title. You hit Control-I and make it italics, right? And so there's a moderate shift in terms of writing your web pages that I'm going to encourage you to do as a best practice.
About coding?
I'm talking about coding. There are multiple ways to think about coding, and a bad way to write HTML is just to translate your word processing practices into HTML coding practices. What I want to encourage you to do is to think about it not in terms of how will it look when the browser renders it, but instead in terms of how do I indicate to the browser what the structure of the text is, and we'll talk about why that is. You have to find someone to host the content. That's not difficult. There are plenty of companies that are happy to get you to pay them to host the content. There are also free web hosting companies that ask you for payment in other ways, like plastering their logo all over your damn site, right? And so I think that free web hosting is actually perhaps not the most professional solution for something like a course website, right? Because it may give either your students or other people who are looking at your course website the idea that your course itself is sponsored by, say, Weebly is one of the more popular ones for free website hosting. However, finding a host is not only not difficult, it doesn't have to be expensive. And I'm using a host right now, nearlyfreespeech.net, that doesn't have a monthly charge. They just charge you by the megabyte that's stored and by the megabyte that gets transferred. And so even with a website that involves, I just looked at this and counted last night, 248 different HTML documents is what mine has grown to over the time I'm in grad school, of which almost 200 are course related, in particular because I made the mistake of promising I'd put everyone's presentation online fall quarter.
How much do they charge for megabyte and NFS?
I can't remember what the actual per megabyte charges. You can take a look at their FAQ on their website. What it comes out to for me is that even with all these documents, and even with actively encouraging my students to go to the section website, and even with telling other TAs in courses that they're welcome to use my website as a resource, it costs me about 4 cents a month. So, I mean, it's absolutely a reasonable. There are other places that have the same pricing model, but this is the one that I've been using and I've been pretty happy for.
But
so,
can you stylize that site, or?
Oh yeah, I mean you could. Oh yeah, I mean they're willing to let you do pretty much anything, including running certain types of programs on their server if you need to do that, which is way more than I'm going to be talking about here, and way more than I know very much about, actually, to be honest. So one of the things that people ask is why not just use GauchoSpace, right? 2 reasons. One is I think GauchoSpace is horrible in terms of its layout and setup, and everybody who is a TA knows that there are plenty of students who just can't find information on GauchoSpace, in part because it doesn't leverage kind of existing web-based reading practices, you know. And everybody knows, at least implicitly, that when you look at a website, you don't necessarily read it from beginning to end. You're scanning for information. And one of the elements of good design that I won't be talking about today, but we'll be talking about next time, is, you know, finding ways to leverage existing scanning practices so that information can be found quickly. The other problem I have with GauchoSpace is that it doesn't help you brag about what a great teacher you are to the external world, right? You can't use it as a representative sample if you're applying for jobs later. Another popular response is, why don't I just use some free blogging service? Because you can take, say, WordPress or Drupal or Tumblr and use them not as blogging services but as content management platforms. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. And one is, if you're going to go to the trouble to learn how to wrench WordPress out of place as a blogging service and turn it into content management kind of a platform for a non-blogging website, you already have to learn as much as you would if you were just learning HTML. Also, if you're typing all your stuff into the WordPress or Tumblr edit box, then you're creating pages that can't easily be moved to another content provider. And also, every blogging service has some restrictions on what you can do with the HTML code, and this is a bad thing for reasons I won't explain until later. But the short version is, I want to encourage you to build your website in ways that can not only be read by web browsers, but also by other machines. And there are a number of advantages to this, and that Tumblr is especially bad here. It restricts what you can do with the HTML code in ways that prevents you from doing that.
What do you mean by information on?
What I mean is that, well, let me give you one example. I guess what I mean is that there's a number of assumptions that get built into how the website itself works that restrict how you can represent that. So, for instance, if you are using WordPress or Tumblr, you don't have the easy ability to organize the files on the website in ways that is productive for you. And again, Tumblr is, I quite like Tumblr for many purposes, such as, keeping a small blog, but I don't know that it's a great choice for a large website, for instance, because you can't create subfolders that help you to organize your content in meaningful ways.
And you mean by assumptions like the mechanisms of how the website works?
Right, like the way that it generates a URL for an individual post is not under your control to a great extent. And I think that that's actually a bigger problem than a lot of people realize. Because a URL should be, in my opinion, this is not necessarily a universally believed thing by web designers, but I think a URL should be meaningful to humans in a sense, as well as to people. And that's why for my own website, you'll notice I have a base URL, and then I organize things into increasingly specific folders.
So generally for websites you pay for, you have more control.
Right, you can organize your file system in any way that you want to if you're paying for the content.
Right.
And so I think that pays off in small but meaningful ways. And so why do I want you to learn HTML and its related technology, CSS, in terms of building your own website? First off, it's not that hard. It really isn't. And the other thing is that you get full control over how your text is presented. And again, with something like WordPress or Tumblr, you have sort of ease of use for flexibility trade-off, right? You can apply a theme to make your website look certain ways. But even if on sites like WordPress and Tumblr, if they're letting you be as flexible as you could if you were building your own website, then you already need to know as much as you would if you were just building your own website from scratch. And, when you're done building your website, you'll have a local copy on your hard drive. And that's easy enough to move if your web hosting provider goes out of business or cancels the service that you're using. Google just about a year ago totally changed the terms of service for what you can do with their website hosting. Their free website hosting is what I'm thinking of. Or, if they start engaging in poor business practices, if you have political differences with them, if they hire a new CEO who's objectionable to you, if there's level of service drops, and I have friends who have done business with various web hosting companies, it's like all of a sudden the pages just take forever to load. If that happens on Tumblr, you have no recourse. If you have built your own website from scratch, you can just move it elsewhere with minimal effort. However, I'm not going to tell you everything that you need to know to be a professional designer in these websites, right? You're not going to walk out of here and get web design contracts. You will walk out of here with enough knowledge to present yourself adequately to the world without being ashamed. And to write websites that are actually useful. So, talking about, you already know how this works in real general terms, right? But just to provide a quick refresher and talk about the mechanics of how web pages are actually displayed in a browser. Generally, you click on a link or you type an address into a browser's address bar. And so your web browser parses that address, breaks it down into its component parts, which we'll talk about a little bit in just a second in slightly more detail, to discover which server is holding the document that you're requesting. And then it either finds and retrieves the document, or if you're doing complex things on the back end, maybe it generates the document, right? Facebook doesn't have a bunch of static HTML pages with people frantically updating them. It just generates them. It runs a program that generates them every time you look at the page. That's a much more complex thing that we're not going to be talking about, but it's a theoretical possibility. Normally you'll have a server serving HTML files for simple applications. On the other hand, you could have a program on a server that generates the HTML files as well. So it identifies where the document is, it fetches the document, and it starts looking through the document, fetches any supporting documents that it needs in order to render it, maybe images, right? If you're writing a website with HTML, you don't embed images in the HTML page itself. You use HTML coding to refer to other images stored elsewhere on the server. And then your browser interprets and displays that, right? So for any URL, you have two major parts. You have a domain name, which is actually a much more expensive thing to purchase than cheap web hosting. A domain name might plausibly cost you $10 to $20 a year. So when I go on the market, will I buy patrickmooney.com? No, actually, some other asshole owns that with his Institute of Unlearning. But I might buy something that is my name rather than a subdomain on nfshost.com. And then you have some sort of a specifier saying where on the server is the document. And so for my own website, I always keep a local copy, right? So there's Patrick, TA, lead TA, web design. And since I took that screenshot, I've changed the names of the documents in that folder. But the idea is keep a local copy on your folder and then periodically upload it to your server so that if, God forbid, you know, the server storing your document gets hit by a nuclear bomb or there's some other catastrophic problem, you should always have copies of your own content. So, what is HTML? HTML is Hypertext Markup Language. You probably already know that. It's a standard way of describing the structure of textual documents on the web. And what I'm trying to tell you here, once again, is you should be talking about the structure of your documents and not how they should look on the screen. It's not a programming language. And if you have any programming experience, then you understand the distinction, because programming languages consist of declarations and commands. You can't do a lot of things with HTML that you could do with a real programming language. You can't even do simple arithmetic with it. It's not a set of instructions, it's a set of markup for individual pieces of text. The other thing to think about is that it doesn't give you complete control over every tiny aspect of the page display. You can get a large amount of control by using its related technology, CSS, which again we'll be talking about in our next workshop. But what you need to do in order to start thinking productively about how web documents appear is to stop thinking about controlling exactly how it looks on the screen. What you need to do is to specify parameters of how it should look. And if you think about it, this is a sensible kind of a thing to do in a lot of ways, because if you are submitting a term paper to your professor or an article to a journal, then they want it displayed in a specific format, right? The target is print. On the other hand, the target for any kind of web-based information display varies hugely from one device to another, right? It's your laptop, it's your tablet, it's your phone. There are people who are still using computers from the early 90s to get on the internet who don't display any kind of text styling information at all. You have people who are looking at web pages on this, you know? And so the important thing to do is not to try to control every aspect of page display, because what you want is pages that will fail gracefully under various circumstances. Yeah, so that's what you need to know about HTML. So let me give you an example. Have a folder open maybe on your desktop somewhere and create a new text document in it. Call the text document index.html.
So open a...
Yeah, open a plain text editor. Okay. I know for earlier versions of Mac OS it used to be called Simple Text. And so text edit is that's it. Thank you. So I keep a folder on my desktop called Working, where I keep my temporary stuff. Call it index.html. And so what I want to suggest, and what I want to really emphasize here, is that any HTML document is a plain text document with structural description. So type in something like this.
Do you want my file to have any specific file format?
Plain text.
Okay.
As if it were a .txt document.
.txt.
But name it with an HTML extension. So I've got one sentence in my plain text document, right? This is not a legal HTML file, but it's surprisingly close to one already. So I have a piece of text here. What I want to do is demonstrate how you mark that up with other information about its structure. So what I'm going to do really is I'm just going to drag this file to my browser, and what you'll see is, even though it's not a valid HTML document yet, the browser understands it well enough to treat it as if it were, right? So what do I have? I have a sentence. If I want to, what I should be doing in order to describe the document more adequately to the browser is to provide information about the structure. And so I'm going to give you bad example of HTML coding just for the sake of illustrating a concept here. So what I've done is I've put an I in between angle brackets before the word most, and then /I in angle brackets after the word most. What does that actually do if I save the document and reload it in the browser? I is for italics, right? Very simple concept. And that's the basic concept of HTML right there, is that you surround text with so-called tags that describe it. I want to encourage you not to ever use the I tag for italics. And one reason for that is that, well, there are two primary reasons for that. There's the real obvious reason immediately, which is the problem of what do you do if your document is being read by something other than a browser, right? Because I doesn't give any information about the semantic meaning of the text that it's containing. It just indicates how it displays. So if your document is being read by a visually impaired person's screen reader, then you have a problem here, right? Obviously, here, the italic text indicates vocal emphasis, which is what the screen reader should be picking up on. What's happening here is that the I tag is indicating only that you're using a title of a longer work, right? So the problem here is that you have two different things that are going on and that they're not machine understandable. The distinction between them is not machine understandable. So what I'd encourage you to do, as always, is to talk in terms of what the actual meaning of the text is, or what the actual meaning of the markup that you're using is. So I'm going to use a pair of different tags. EM for emphasis, right? Meaning I'm emphasizing this conceptually. If you're reading it out loud, you should emphasize it vocally. Using the cite tag is actually not semantically correct here, but it's a lot closer to semantically correct because the cite tag is actually for proper citations, which is not actually what I'm doing here. Still, this is closer to being a meaningful and semantically coded HTML document. And you'll notice if I reload it after saving it, that I still get the same visual appearance. Again, this is a crucial distinction that I want people to understand. That you should be talking not about how it appears on the page, but rather what it actually means. Okay, so this is still not a valid HTML document, but it's getting closer. In order to make it a valid HTML document, there's a number of other tags that I have to use. For one thing, text doesn't just get to float around on the page. You have to indicate where paragraphs begin and end. Okay. And technically speaking, the entire document should be enclosed in tags that begin and end the HTML content. What you have here is a set of tags, beginning tags and ending tags, right? EM and /EM, begin and end the part of the text that's emphasized. From a technical vocabulary perspective, the EM tag here is called a container. That is to say, the EM and close EM tags contain the word most, just as the cite and closing cite tags enclose the title 1Q84. Still not quite a valid HTML document because HTML documents also have to have two major sections in them. One is the heading, which must contain a title. And it has to have a body. Which contains your actual content. There's a lot more that can go in the heading, and we'll talk about that more in our third section. But the absolute requirement is the title. You'll notice if I save this and then reload the page that I get the title in the title bar of the browser. This is a minimally acceptable HTML document. It's not a great document, and there are reasons why you may want to include other things besides just including your other text. One thing that I want to emphasize at this point too is that HTML collapses white space. What that means is that you can have as many spaces or returns or tabs anywhere in the document that you want to without affecting its appearance on the screen. I think I've done enough to illustrate the point there. But you'll notice that I'm indenting and putting extra returns in, and if I reload the page, all of those extra spaces and extra returns collapse to individual spaces. This means that, well, this is another reason why you should properly mark up your text using paragraph tags, aside from the fact that you're formally required to. That is to say, you want that paragraph to begin and end where you've indicated that paragraph should begin and end. One reason that I like using a programming editor for writing HTML is that it does a number of things that are useful in terms of helping you write semantically meaningful, properly valid HTML, like highlighting. If you click on a beginning or end tag, it highlights the other half of the pair so that you can see where it is. What I would like to encourage people to do in general is to take advantage of the fact that you can do this in order to engage in practices that help you keep track of where you are in your own layout. So here, what do I have now? I have 2 paragraphs, right? You'll notice that one thing that's missing that you'll see on most HTML pages that are written on the web is you don't have a heading that appears in the at the top of the page. This is not the same as the title and the title bar necessarily. And so the H1 tag is usually the tag that indicates what the major title of the document is. There are other tags, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6, all of which are used for increasingly lower levels of headings. I can't imagine that there are many people who need more than 6 levels of headings in any kind of a document ever. And of course, one thing that you'll notice here is that there are, in fact, a lot of web pages that have this basic appearance on them, right, throughout the web, but they're not the ones that people like to look at. And so this is kind of an ugly default formatting that gets applied by web browsers. And what I'd encourage you to worry about at this point is not that, or rather not appearance, but are you properly structuring the representation of your document in terms of the structure of the text itself. I also think that in general, despite the fact that I added a bunch of extra spaces and tabs in that document, it's a poor practice because it makes it harder for you to read your own writing. And that one of the things that you should be doing in general is writing code that you can read. The other thing that I like too about having a programmer's editor is that if you are indenting your tags, it will automatically indent subsequent lines after return. Okay. And that is the basic concept in HTML. You've got a string of text which is marked up with various tags to indicate what its structure is. There are maybe 2 or 3 dozen tags that you'll ever actually use. I did not mean to go to the end of the presentation there. I meant to hit page down. So that's it. Everything that you see on the web that is produced as an HTML document is just that, or some slightly more complex version of that. If you go to a web page and you don't see any text, this is still the metaphor that's being used to load whatever other information is on there. And yes, there are several dozen different tags. Most of them you'll never use. Most people I know have no use for the H6 tag, right? You don't need a subheading most of the time. You should also be aware tags can have so-called attributes, and sometimes tag attributes are mandatory for certain tags. We'll talk about this example here with the image tag. If you're going to insert an image into the document, then yes, you absolutely have to indicate what the name of the image file is in order to pull it in. There's some rules for putting tags in. One is that every tag that you open, you have to close. If the tag is a container for textual material, you have to close it after wherever that textual material ends. So here, again, the cite tag and the close cite tag enclose the name of a title of a book. Technically speaking, you were supposed to close the tags in the reverse order that you opened them. That is to say, right here, what you have is that the I tag, which is for italics, encloses a block of text that also includes the B tag, which is for bold text. Again, I would encourage you not to ever use the B tag, because there are better ways to do so. But just for the sake of having a short example with one letter tags, do you see the difference between the correct and incorrect examples? Okay, if I'm opening the B tag last, I have to close it first, is what it comes down to. Some tags are not containers for textual content, right? If I'm inserting a picture of a kitten onto my web page, that's an object on its own. It's not a container that contains other text. It's worth pointing out that every piece of text that you deal with is already marked up in various ways, right? And that if you've read Jerome McGann's Radiant Textuality, then you know that he makes a big deal out of this, about why HTML coding is a sensible thing for literary theorists to know. And I happen to agree with him on that, even though I'm not a digital humanist myself. And so it's important to realize that you never just have text freed of any context. There's always paratextual information in any piece of text that you encounter. That when you have a book, a novel, say, marked up, it's already marked up just by virtue of the fact that it has pages on it, that it has paragraphs, that there are things like italic text, which is, from a certain point of view, already a paratextual element that tells you something about that piece of text relationship to the text around it. And so all you're doing when you're marking things up with HTML is making a certain set of interpretive clues explicit for machines. So to give you a slightly more fleshed out example of what a minimally acceptable HTML document looks like, there are two more things that you need to do. And there's multiple various versions of HTML that are available on the web. And so all that doc type thing is doing is declaring explicitly which version of HTML you're using so the browser doesn't have to guess. It's a long, ugly string that's not meant to be human readable. You just need to copy and paste it from either a reference on the web. There are various lists of doc types that you can use. Or else just use a previously created HTML document as a template, which is what I always do. You'll notice that there's an XML-NS attribute on the HTML tag there. And the reason for that is that I'm teaching you XHTML. There's a number of reasons why I picked this particular version, and it's not just that it's the version I use myself, but probably the least important to most people in our department is that XHTML is a version of HTML that is also valid XML. So what does that actually mean? It means if you're doing other text processing stuff with the documents that you write, then you are able to easily use XML-based tools, which are quite popular, to also transform those documents in various ways. Probably more central in terms of why I want to teach XHTML in particular as opposed to various other versions are two things. One is that XHTML 1.0 strict is what I'm actually showing you here, enforces a number of good practices. In particular, it expects that you will mark up your text semantically and treats tags like I and B as meaningless. That isn't to say that browsers won't render them anyway, but it is to say that if you run your web page through a validator, it will catch things like you were doing presentational rather than semantic markup. It's also the case that the rules are simpler for XHTML to remember. That is to say, a lot of things that can go one way or another in other versions of HTML tend to be done consistently in XHTML, in part because it wants documents to be very easily parsable by XML parsers. So there are things like, there's some rules that I'll be talking about later. One thing that XHTML enforces is your tags always have to be in lowercase. That's non-optional. Again, not hard, but easier than remembering a set of rules with a set of exceptions. I think consistency is useful. So tags are really divided into two classes from a certain point of view. You have block level tags, right? Block level tags are tags like P. What do? When they're rendered by the browser, they create a new block. So P does that. You can probably figure out what block quote is for. H1, H2, all the other heading tags down through H6. You can create lists with UL and OL, and they then contain list items, LI. So taking this and using it as a way of building just sort of the front page to a section website. Say I were recreating my section website for last summer. What would I actually have? I'd probably have a heading, English 192. Notice that HTML doesn't enforce any human meaningful semantic values, right? It's not technically erroneous not to capitalize the first letters of sentences for that reason, for instance. And then I might have a series of resources, right? What'll I have? I might want to put them in a bulleted list, which is the UL tag. I think that as a best practice, when you're doing tags that enclose a lot of other tags, it's easier to open and close them immediately, and then go back and add in whatever comes in the middle. I also think that as a best practice in general, it's better to use increasing levels of indentation so that you can signal to yourself visually where you are. Again, this won't affect the actual rendering of the HTML in the browser. I'll talk about this in just a minute. So what does this actually look like when I pull it into a browser? Not real impressive yet, but what I want to do is to take this as a basis and use it to start developing a meaningful section website that could be used as the basis for how you display things to students. So here are some, maybe I would want to have more specific verbiage up here, like a course description, right? And maybe I'd want to have more links, and eventually I'll probably have links to any slideshows that I give. So this is what my course website actually wound up looking like. What do I have? I have a course syllabus. I have a login for the Gaucho Space page that I was using to distribute optional readings. An extra credit survey, makeup quiz, any number of various resources. And then at the bottom, one of the things that I do is I tend to post any slideshows that I make online. Why? Because A, it's useful for students when they're reviewing for the final. B, it means that I don't have to send everybody an email every time a new slideshow becomes available. And C, it makes things visible online. So if anybody wants to go look at Lecture 12, I don't even remember what Lecture 12 was offhand, but I hope it's good. Okay. I host it externally on SlideShare. Why? Because I'm paying by the byte for my own hosting and data transfer. And so often, using an external service like SlideShare to host my content makes it free for me. Whereas if I had to host it myself, then A, it wouldn't be free, and B, what would happen if I just had a PowerPoint that downloaded? Well, then it wouldn't look like this, it would open up in PowerPoint. And that may or may not be good for the students, but from here they have the option to download it as PowerPoint if they want to, or they can just page through it. Okay. So there's a number of block level tags. There's also a number of inline tags that you can use meaningfully in order to give your website, in order to mark up how your text is being used or what kind of purposes you have for your text. And I think these are all fairly straightforward, right? Every so often you'll want to indicate to someone what an abbreviation stands for. Probably at least one student in my course doesn't know what MLA stands for. And so I can indicate that. With the abbreviation tag ABBR. You'll notice it gives a specific visual appearance of a dotted underline, and if you mouse over it, it'll expand that. You can control whether you actually have, excuse me, a dotted underline. But we'll talk about that next time. The BR tag enforces a line break at a specific point. You'll notice there's something I skipped over that I meant to talk about earlier, which is that the BR tag is not a container, right? You just have a line break. It's a sort of a point, not a line. What happens? It encounters that tag and it forces a break. It's not containing other text. In XHTML, tags that aren't containers can be self-closed, and that just means that you type a space and the closing slash before the end of the tag. So, cite marks a citation, code marks up computer code. Usually what that means is that the browser will display it in a monospaced font. However, don't use code to get a monospaced font. Use code to mark up actual computer code. Again, all your markup should be semantic. The EM tag marks up text that's emphasized. As you've already seen, that means that it will be presented in an italic style. You can use the image tag, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a little bit, to embed an image in your web page. You can use strong to mark up text that's very strongly emphasized. By default, that means bold. And if you are quoting someone, then by golly, you can use the Q tag, which has the nice benefit not only of semantically meaning, here I'm quoting someone, but also it tends to be rendered by browsers using smart quotes, which are hard to type on your keyboard. However, again, don't use the Q tag just to get smart quotes. Use it to mark up that a piece of text semantically is a quotation. So there's an image tag, which of course is used to embed images in the pages, right? There's a number of attributes that there are two attributes that are required. You have to indicate what the image name is and where it is. You'll notice that I'm providing an example here of, say you have an image with a man with a fake beard, then you might call it fakebeard.jpg, right? Ideally, you mark up the width and the height of the image. Why? Because if the image is downloading slowly, then the browser would have to wait for it to download completely before it could render the rest of the page. If you put in the width and the height, then it can at least leave a blank there and keep rendering the rest of the web page. You are technically required to have alternate text, which is what does the speech reader say if the page is being parsed by a speech reader for people with visual impairments. Often, say 98% of the time, this makes sense. The other 2% of the time, you have a purely decorative image, and what you should do there is just put a space inside the quotation marks to satisfy the technical requirement that you need to have some alternate text. You'll notice here that you can put not only the name of a file in the same folder, but you can specify the full URL to an image somewhere else on the internet. And you'll notice too the image tag is self-closed because it doesn't contain other text. There's a couple of things that are worth thinking about in terms of using images on your website. And one is that less is a lot more in a lot of ways. And that if you're just putting a bunch of damn images on your website just because you can put a bunch of damn images on your website, then you look like a 12-year-old, right? That thinking about what properly belongs on any individual page is a mark of professionalism. And so if you have the front page of your website appear, that appears when people just go to your website, what you probably don't want is to have everything about you on that web page. What you want is, you know, a quick blurb and options for finding more information. And that actually, one of the identity formation websites that I like quite a bit is about.me, that kind of enforces this there really is just one page above the fold that gives some basic information just to pick a random person off of About Me. You know, here's one page, just that. And it doesn't seem to be rendering. Oh, there we go. So what you have, this is actually not a bad model conceptually, although it would be hard to design for what it might look like to just have a front page for your website. Here's who I am, here's some interests that I have, here's some links to other stuff that I've done. So don't put a picture of everything that you've eaten on your front page. Don't put a picture of you and your dog. Don't put a picture of you and your girlfriend and a picture of the sunset you took on the beach. Because, quite frankly, it looks unprofessional and it will take forever to render. You'll notice that I said earlier that you can... Did I talk about this explicitly? Yes. Well, talking about technical considerations more for a minute. Images are often much larger than the HTML files that refer to them, right? So there's a number of considerations that are relevant here. One is, make the images, you don't need to have huge image files for web display because generally speaking, people's screens don't display high-resolution images anyway. So you can take up a huge chunk of your page's visual space with images that are maybe 400, 600, 800 pixels tall or wide. You don't need to have the photograph that you took at 18 megapixels if you're taking it on your web page. So downsizing it will have a number of benefits, such as it'll transfer faster, it'll render better in the web page, and it doesn't take up a huge amount of screen space. As a rule of thumb, if you don't know specific reasons for doing other things, you should use JPEG images for photographs and PNG for anything that's like a line drawing. If you have specific reasons for doing otherwise, then you already know what they are. The other thing to consider is that JPEG and PNG are the best supported formats by web browsers themselves. And so you definitely don't want to be including TIFF or Windows bitmap files on your web pages, both because they're huge files and because browsers may or may not support them. You can save time and money by hosting your images somewhere else, and there are a number of websites that do exactly that, right? So Imgur is a popular one. You can host your images on Flickr. You can host your images on PhotoBucket and load from their servers instead of yours, which means you don't have to pay for the bandwidth and you don't have to pay for their storage. However, just because you can use a URL anywhere on the internet of an image that's already on the internet doesn't mean that you should. And there are two major reasons for that. One is, if you are just finding some photo that some dude put on his website and then you put it on your website, technically you are republishing it, and that is a copyright violation if you don't have his permission. The other problem is that if you are just copying and pasting a URL for some photo that you found on the internet, then you don't have control over what that image is. And if somebody notices that you're doing that, one of the nasty tricks that I've seen played in the past is that they will replace it with something else. So I had a friend who was applying for an internship as an undergrad who wanted to demonstrate that he knew HTML coding and submitted his resume that way, and had a background image where he did exactly that. He found a background image he liked, he put its URL as the background image URL, and pointed the company he was applying for the internship with to that web page. The night before they actually evaluated his application, whoever it was whose image he was hot linking to noticed that he was doing that, was upset, and so they replaced the image with an image of a man of diminutive stature on a tricycle wearing nothing but a leather vest and a policeman's hat. So that was the background image for his resume when they looked at it. And, you know, needless to say, he did not get the job. So, I mean, make sure that if you are, in fact, hosting your images elsewhere, that that is explicitly okay with whoever's image you're linking to. Another major inline tag you should know about, the A tag, is used primarily to create links. Obviously enough. And actually, chances are that in any web design that you do, you will be using the A tag a lot, right? This is the A tag is what makes the World Wide Web into a web. It links documents to each other. The A tag, generally speaking, is a container. That is to say, if I put this around here, then, you know, what I'm saying is that the text course syllabus is a link to the document syllabus.html. You'll notice that I'm not specifying any folder path names or anything like that. So what that means is the document is in the same folder. So if I save that and render it again, you'll notice this appears as a link. Of course, there is no document syllabus.html at the moment, but you could create one. So really, what you'll have when you look at your website is you'll have a folder on your hard drive that contains some HTML files. Probably it will also have a number of other folders in it in which you organize your information in some way that's meaningful to you. So this is the path to the current website that I'm developing as the course goes along. It has an index.html page and then a bunch of various documents that I develop as the course goes on, and then link from that image index.html page. I mean, that's the short version. What do you have in your website folder? Whatever you need to have in order to support the HTML files that are there. There's another use for the H tag that is possibly less commonly used, but is incredibly useful, and that's to create an anchor point for linking to a specific location in a file. So, God, what quarter is it? Spring. Okay. I do this all the time, over and over, in my section guidelines handout, right? Why? Because I'm specifying a bunch of policies, and I want to be able to link to those policies from emails so that I can say to students, I told you so. So here I'll have a link to a policy that I've named No Very Late Papers, right? And so that if a student emails me in week 9 and says, here's the paper that was due in week 4, I can send an email back saying, here's the policy that says I don't accept papers that late. And so in order to be able to create a link to a specific part in the document, basically you just have to give it a name. I tend to also give it an ID, which is not technically necessary, but I build that in because I think I may want it someday and it's easier to do it as I go along. We'll talk about what the ID attribute is for later. But all I really need to do is this. You'll notice that if I'm using the A tag this way, I generally self-close it. That's not absolutely necessary. I could just as well also do this. For that matter, I could just as well also do this. It doesn't really matter. And when you create a link to an anchor point, you'll have your standard URL. I'm assuming that I'm going to be linking to this from inside an email, so I'll give a fully qualified URL, including the domain name. And then use a pound sign and then the name that you gave it in the name tag. This is really the only complicated thing that I'm going to talk about today, the only genuinely complicated thing. And what I want to point out here is that there's a number of different ways to specify URLs. You can always use a fully qualified URL starting with HTTP:// and a domain name if you want to, but that gets really cumbersome. And it also is harder to maintain if you think you may need to move documents around from one folder to another on your website. And so sometimes it's helpful to, instead of doing this, or this, to just refer to documents that are in the same folder, right? So I might do something like this. Again, I haven't specified some of the mandatory attributes here, just because I'm trying to illustrate the concept. But if I have a document that is on my server, in the ~Patrick folder, in the TA folder, in the ~Patrick folder, and it's called index.html, then any of the relative paths that I can use make the assumption that I'm talking about relative to this particular document, index.html. So if I just use a file name with no slashes in it, the assumption is in the same folder. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, if we have this as the base document, I can link to other folders in the same, I can link to files in subfolders of the existing folder, right? So if I'm starting here in the TA folder, then I might have another document called index.html, which is in this relative path down through the hierarchy, the folder hierarchy. So the file index.html in the folder eng133so in the folder s14, which is in the current folder. You can also, if you want to, refer to things in the folder above the current folder, right? So if I'm here, then /personal.html means this. You can use as many levels of // as are sensible. You can move up 3 levels this way, you can move up 4 levels this way. I don't do this very often at all, actually. But it is a potential thing that you can do. You can also always drill down from the very top of the folder. So if I have a folder, that is to say, if you start your URL in any way, in any context, and it's worth pointing out that you can do this anytime that you use URLs, not just for the A tag. But the href, of course, is what the link refers to. And so a single slash means the top level folder. And then I have a folder in there called ~Patrick, and in that folder I have something called personal.html. This is useful because it's not really a relative path, except insofar as it's relative to the root of the file system, or it's relative, you might think, to the specific computer on the internet that this domain name points to. So the URL here begins with a slash and then specifies all the folders down to the document that you're talking to. The fact that you can type things like this and this is yet another reason why you should have a sensible layout of folders in your website. One that you can keep track of mentally without having to constantly be going back to your local copy. Well, that just looks awful on this particular screen. Another thing that you can frequently do, may or may not frequently do, will probably want to do occasionally, is specify information in tabular form. I don't think that I probably need to say that this is an example that you would never ever use in real life, right? You're not ever going to put student names and grades as public information on the web. That would be a horrible violation of privacy, and would make the university angry with you. Let me see if I can fix that quickly. Apparently not. Here we go. So, if you're creating a table, all you really need to do is to open the table with the table tag, close it with this close table tag at the end, and then have a series of rows, possibly with a heading. If we want, actually let me just copy and paste this into a document and I'll show you how it looks. Again, I would never ever do this in real life, but it's not a bad, quick way to illustrate a concept. Interesting. Is this valid? Or have I forgotten to close something? Ideally, this should be rendering against the side, and I don't immediately see why it's not working properly. But what I'm suspecting is that I've forgotten to close something. What I'm not doing properly here is controlling display in terms of centering with CSS. And actually Firefox is often not the greatest way to display unstyled information, despite the fact that it has advantages we'll be exploiting in workshops 2 and 3. So, in any case, we have a minimalist website that we can check to see why this isn't working, actually, because that looks to me like it should be behaving properly. This is perhaps a good place to introduce the validator that the World Wide Web Consortium provides, which lets you upload your files and check to see if they're displayed correctly. I'm not including a doc type, which is perhaps one of the reasons that this is failing. So let's try again. Yet another reason to include a doc type in your at the top of your HTML document. And I will correct the online version of this before I post it. That is the typo that I made. A table heading is actually also a table row, and that's what I get for designing my slideshows late at night. That is to say, a table consists of rows, some of which contain table data cells. This should be TR and this should be TH. Some of which contain data cells, some of which contain heading cells. But ideally, what you'll have when you display it properly is something like this. Really, what are you doing? You're just telling it where the individual parts of the spreadsheet begin and end. Does that seem sensible? Yeah. Okay. So a table consists of individual rows, either with header cells or data cells. You'll notice that by default, header cells look different, right? They're centered and in bold. Again, you can control exactly how that works with CSS. It was a common practice in the 90s to enclose entire documents in table data, or in tables, to control the layout so that you could have, say, a bar over to the left-hand side. There are far better ways to do that, and this is a bad idea for a number of reasons. One is that, awesome, I love our new secure internet. One is that if you have stuff in a table, generally speaking, the browser can't render anything in the table until everything has been downloaded and parsed. So if you have the entire document in the table, and especially if it's a long document, you won't have the document appearing on screen as it's loading. It also interferes with, again, screen readers for visually impaired people. And is a poor practice insofar as it doesn't indicate what the semantic structure of your document is. Tables have a semantic meaning, which is the display of tabular information. There are some characters that you shouldn't directly type into an HTML document because they have a special reserved meaning, right? The obvious examples are greater than and less than signs. What do those mean in HTML? This is a tag, right? So if you need to use beginning and less than signs, then you should use alternate versions of them. The ampersand also has a meaning, actually. It's reserved for, well, beginning a special entity, right? So you can't just type an ampersand into it. And quotation marks are what you enclose attribute values and tags in. So I think personally that this one is the most annoying, that I tend to forget when I'm writing directly in HTML because I just want to use quote marks. And it's a hard habit to break yourself of. So if you have a character other than these four, and arguably the single quote, which you can get away with using, but is technically, if you're a very, very picky person, supposed to be and a pause, semicolon, because technically single quotes are reserved as well, and mean the same thing as double quotes. If you have a special character, something that doesn't appear on your keyboard, the pound sign, the euro sign, the U with an umlaut over it, you can type that directly in if you have an easy way to do that. You can type in basically anything except these four things if you have an easy way to do that, if you want to use the character mapping applications. But it's sometimes easier, especially for things that special characters that you use a lot, to just start learning some of these so-called entities. Technically, each of these also has a numeric representation, which would save you typing over and E acute semicolon. You might just be able to type 3 numbers, but by God, they're harder to learn. If you also have Windows experience and you know how to hold down the Alt key and type on the numeric keypad, basically you can use those numbers if you know them. In case it's not already obvious here, by taking a look at the distinction between these two various representations, case matters, and often especially for special characters that represent letters in non-Roman alphabets, or at least non-English alphabets. Uppercase and lowercase is the variation between the capital and lowercase version of the special entity. Here's a list of tags that you'll see, and you'll see them used in various ways on websites. And if you're editing a blog post that you're typing in HTML, you'll notice that almost every blogging platform gives you the opportunity to edit the HTML directly, which is sometimes the best way to get the effect that you want. Sometimes this is the version of HTML that you'll be using, which is based on so-called HTML4.
What does blink do?
Blink makes people hate you. Is the short version. What it actually does is just what it sounds like. It makes the text blink on and off.
Oh.
Really, really, really annoying. And it was one of those things that got introduced in HTML 2.0 back in the very early 90s when the World Wide Web hadn't yet quite taken off. And it was introduced by Netscape, if you even remember Netscape, when they were trying to win the browser wars against Internet Explorer. This was one of their innovations that they used to try to get people to switch to Netscape, was that Netscape can display blinking text. And before there was pretty much any kind of active content on the web, this was one way to get a little bit of animation onto your page.
So is the cursor also blinking?
No, it's just, well, I mean, I'll show, I don't even know if it will work in current versions of Firefox. I think I may have explicitly disabled it. Not blick, blink. Okay. No, it's not working. But, and I think it's just that people hate it so much that it's disabled by default on most browsers now. But if it were working, what you would see is this line of text blinking on and off when it's rendered by the browser. It's universally hated by all web designers and is a cause for ridicule by anyone. So again, all I want you to understand is that these tags are also containers, and sometimes you will see them used. So when you're marking up your text with HTML, there's a number of things that you should do, and some of these you have to do, especially if you're using XHTML. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think XHTML is the version of HTML that's ideal to use. Stop trying to connect to the internet. You're not going to do it. Good HTML follows the semantic rules of HTML. Things like you should close tags in the reverse order that you open them. You should close every tag that you open. You should have an element that's called HTML. You should enclose your blocks of text in some sort of block level container like P or LI, right? Or OL. You shouldn't just have text floating around without being in a container that's a block level container. You should enclose attribute values in quotation marks. This is mandatory in XHTML and optional in other versions of HTML under certain circumstances. Most importantly, when you're writing a web page, make sure that it's something that you can read without it being horribly confusing to you. And again, this is why I encourage you to do things like indent subsequent tags more and outdent them as you close them. So again, HTML collapses white space. You can put in as many spaces and tabs and carriage returns as you want to make the structure of your document clear to yourself without affecting how your document looks when the browser renders it. And I'm going to say it again, even though I've said it repeatedly before, what you should be doing is not trying to word process with HTML. What you should be doing is to indicate the structure of the text that you're working with. The short version of how do you control appearance is that you create another document that describes how appearance looks. And that's what we'll be talking about next time with CSS. But it's a really good practice for a huge number of reasons not to use tags like font and I to control your text. In part because if you describe the semantic meaning of, or the semantic structure of your document, what you then do is create another document that you can apply to all the pages on your website that says things like the heading, the first level heading should be in 24-point Arial. It's a lot easier to do that and apply it to every document on your website than it is to go through every document on your website and make sure you remember to change everything to 24-point Arial bold, or whatever the case may be. There are some attributes that you can apply to any tag. One of them is ID. What does that mean? It means you're giving this particular tag a unique ID. Why? I actually don't do that very often. But again, occasionally it's useful to do so in order to control from your style sheets exactly how particular sections of the page look. In case it's not already obvious, there is no tag. This is just a sample that I'm using for, you could put an ID on your A tag. You could put it on your there is no href tag. You could put it on almost anything. Same thing with class. A tag is supposed to be unique across an entire web page, and technically if you create two tags with the same ID, then you are committing an error. But it may be that you want to, and I think this is a much more useful thing to do, you may want to create a whole class of tags where you might create a class of P tags called first paragraph, which is styled differently, right? Maybe you want it to have a drop cap, or you want it to be in a larger font size. You'll notice that I say several times up here, for some purpose of your own. And I realize that that's vague, and it's intentionally so. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about in our next two workshops is what are these purposes under which you might group together various tags. One is to control the appearance, right? That I might want to have some of my links appear in different colors, or that some of the links I create might be in bold and italic and some are not, for whatever reason. The other thing is that using ID and class attributes is a way of merging with certain existing standards about how you indicate the structure of your document in more meaningful ways to certain pieces of software. So one of the things that we'll be talking about in section 3 is how do you give hints to Google about your web page, about who the actual author is, about what is being described in this part of the text in a machine-readable form. You can also enclose valid CSS style information using the style attribute, which you can apply to any tag. This is a bad way to do styling because you're back to just replacing a bad practice with HTML with a CSS version, right? I don't want to have to enclose, that is to say, if I have 248 documents on my website, all of which are in HTML, it's much easier to just type once that the H1 tag is 24-point Arial and not go back and apply a style attribute to the H1 tag in all of those 248 documents. But this is sometimes handy if you just want to quickly see how something looks, or if you're defining something for one page that you don't plan on using regularly. There's two tags that don't do anything, and that is to say, they don't do anything that's immediately visible to the user unless you're pairing them with other things. But the idea here is that you will pair them with things like the class attribute and the ID attribute. And so you can group together some miscellaneous chunk of text for whatever reason that you use. So I use the span tag a lot, right? What does the span tag say? It just says, here's a group of text that I'm pulling out and identifying in some way. Quite frequently, the way that I make text italic is by putting span class equals book title around it. Does book title inherently have a meaning to the browser? No. What I then do is I define a style in my CSS style sheet that says, I'm just going to turn off my network card, that then says, anytime I have a class that's called book title, put it in italics. And the span tag is for inline groups of text, right? Any arbitrary group of text that appears in another block. If I want to create a larger series or a larger chunk in some way, then you can use div, which just encloses pretty much anything as long as it's not appearing inside of another block. So, I mean, one thing that I typically do, or one thing that you might do, is to create a div with a particular class. Maybe it says document header, right? And so then maybe what I'll do is I'll change the background color on the document header and put a border around it and put it in a larger font, something like that. We'll talk about these extensively next time. Why am I beating these various horses about creating semantically valid material? Well, a number of reasons, actually. And one of those is that you can get away with writing bad HTML. And if you don't run it through a validator, then you may not even know you're writing bad HTML. The problem there are a number of problems that you run into there. And the most obvious is that if you are writing valid HTML, then all browsers have to render it in basically the same way in order to be standards compliant. If you write invalid HTML, and the closing, well, here's a very simple example that I gave you earlier of invalid HTML. If you are using a version of HTML that allows presentational tags like INB, and you do this, without exception, every browser out there will figure out what you really mean. But if you're doing more complex versions of this, then different browsers will take different guesses. And it may or may not look, even if it looks great in whatever you're testing it on, it may not look great when somebody looks at it on their iPhone in Safari. Or it may not, look great in Opera, Google Chrome, Billy Joe Bob's browser, the AOL browser, whatever else people might be using. Remember that people get on the internet in a huge number of ways, and you really only have two options if you want your pages to look well. You can make sure you're writing valid HTML, or you can check them on every combination of device and browser that gets used. Also, if you are writing presentational HTML, as I've already suggested, instead of semantic HTML to which you're applying styles, so much more effort to maintain. If you decide that you want to change how your website looks, and I'll be the first to say that I am not happy with how my website looks right now and it could use a makeover. But that's a comparatively simple thing to do for the entire website all in one fell swoop if I'm using CSS to style it. If I have a bunch of font and size tags, then I would have to go through and change all of those. So although it seems complex to do at first, that the fact of the matter is putting that extra little bit of effort in to write semantically in the first place, to code semantically in the first place, makes it easier to maintain in the long term. The other thing is that if you are using invalid HTML, or if you are using presentational instead of semantic HTML, you're limiting your options for how other machines other than the browser will read your content. Remember that machines read too a lot of the time, that Google's search engine loads and parses pages and needs to find information about them. If you are just putting in a bunch of font tags, then Google has to take a guess as to what the actual title of your document is. And so again, writing and coding with the understanding that there are a lot of ways of parsing information on the web that are not looking at it on your screen is incredibly important. So how do you write, how do you make sure that your web pages are well designed? You should write good HTML in the first place. Putting that extra 3 to 10% of effort in required will save you a lot of effort down the road. Make sure that it's intelligible to you. Make sure that it indicates the semantic structure of the document. Use a text editor that helps you to check validity with features like syntax highlighting, right? So that you can keep track when you start encoding a lot of stuff into individual paragraphs where individual tags begin and end. If Bluefish doesn't work for you, there are plenty of other plain text programmer editors that will do essentially the same things. You should always test your web pages on at least 2 browsers, right? If you're used to using Firefox, then also do it in Safari or Google Chrome or Opera or some minimalist browser that's available for free on the internet like Midori. Check it on your phone, check it on someone else's phone, check it on a tablet. The idea is to check it on at least 2 widely divergent platforms so that any thoughtless assumptions that you've made that happen to depend on how it looks on your particular setup will hopefully be exposed. And you should always check your formal validity with a validator. The W3C has one, and again there's a link to this at that webpage. It's just at validator.w3c.org, and it will be very, very picky, especially if you are properly identifying your web page with the doc type as you're supposed to. And it'll complain extensively about any little thing that you do wrong, which you should then go back and fix. Again, you will probably forget to do lots of things as you start practicing this, but the validator will help you catch that. Talking about how do you actually organize a website, there's a number of things that are worth thinking about right off the top. One is, don't try to put everything on one page. I said that earlier. But think about how your front page of your website should be, there are worse models when thinking about it in terms of a business card. Quick blurb, how are you? Not how are you, who are you, right? I'm Patrick Mooney. I'm a transatlantic modernist in the English department at UC Santa Barbara. I'm a graduate student working on a dissertation prospectus that involves 20th century literary representations of suicide. Here are some links to other things about me. Here you can find me on other websites, Google+, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you think is professional. I don't have a link to my Facebook account on my homepage, to be honest. But whatever you think is a fair professional representation of you. Remember that people don't sit down and read from beginning to end very often on the internet at all. So use good journalistic writing practices. Break your information into multiple documents, each of which is more or less complete in itself, and each of which you link to other relevant documents. As a good practice, always give the user a good way to get back to your home page so that they don't have to use the back button in their browser or wind up editing the address by hand in the address bar, which many people don't know how to do even if you do. Good journalistic writing practices. Most important information first. Anything that's crucial comes above the fold. Remember that if we're using the above the fold metaphor, where the fold happens varies a great deal from one device to another, right? I mean, the ideal situation is you want everything that's crucial to appear immediately on screen and not be something the user has to scroll down to. Where does the user have to scroll down? Heavily dependent on what kind of device they're using. So again, decreasing importance as the document goes on is a good practice. And you want to show the structure of the document to the viewer so that they don't have to read every word on there in order to find what they're looking for, right? Use markup that, for instance, uses the heading tags in order to indicate what the major groupings of information on your page are. Have links that are sensibly chosen so that if people are just skimming through looking for links, they know what they need to click on to find what they're looking for. Organize your files in a series of folders that make sense to you, right? Divide up your various files that constitute your website into some kind of system that you can remember easily, so you're not always digging through your own website's file structure. So, I mean, for me, this is a pretty sensible set of organizational practices. Do you have to use the same one? No. You should do something that works for you. So I have, a page with contact information, a page describing current projects, which badly needs to be updated, a page that is the main page for my website, which is not fantastic, but it's something. Again, I'm not a great designer. I have a page that has more personal information about me. If you want to find me on other sites, here's a list, kind of a page. And then there's a bunch of folders that contain more specific information. I think this is a good general practice for how you can organize a website, because again, it makes sense to you, and the URL encodes some information for anyone who's looking at it. Every folder that you include, generally speaking, should have an index.html file in it. And the reason for that is, if you create a link, or someone else creates a link that doesn't point to a file, but just points to a folder, your web server will retrieve that index.html file and display it. What happens if you don't have an index.html file? Depends on how your web server is configured. You might get an error message. You might just have a listing, an ugly-looking listing of everything that's in the directory. Something more or less like this. Well, that's not really helpful to your average web user, right? They don't know that they're looking for the index.html file to open. So, include an index.html file. Make it an overview of what's in that folder and or its subfolders. So we're wrapping up. There is time for questions if you have any. But basically, you won't have learned anything, even though you were working along somewhat, unless you actually apply these skills. And so my suggestion is take the first steps towards building a website for your discussion section that you're a TA for this quarter, or in any other way that is in some way gets you to start marking up some text with HTML. So if you have a section guidelines handout that you're using this quarter, my suggestion is mark it up with HTML. Create an HTML version of it. My strong suggestion to follow up on that is don't just open up Microsoft Word and save as HTML, because basically every document, or every program, that's what I'm trying to say, that gives you a chance to export a file as HTML creates just horrible HTML. And the reason for that is pretty much, well, there's a lot of reasons for that actually, but the primary reason for that, I would say, is that almost everyone tries very hard to create HTML that is presentational. That is to say, what Word wants to do is to create an HTML file that you can open up in Word and it looks exactly the same. So what that winds up doing is obscuring the structure greatly. What I'd recommend that you do is you take some textual document that you have and just copy and paste it into a plain text document, which will just create the text. Then go back through and force yourself to indicate what the structure is to yourself. There's the beginning of a paragraph. It contains some mandatory line breaks. There's the end of a paragraph. Here's the title of the prospectus. Actually, that's not the title. The title is 2 lines long, so that's the end of the title. Here's a secondary heading. And so forth and so on. Go through and make yourself think about what the structure of your textual documents is and mark them up. So if you have a section guidelines handout that is a Word document, I recommend not exporting it from Word. I recommend copying and pasting and going through and finding where you need to do other markup. Once you've done that, stop popping down menu bar. Once you've done that, run it through the validator and see what you missed. See if you forgot to close tags. See if you forgot that you can't use quotes. Again, that is the single most annoying thing about HTML for me, is not being able to use double quotes by default, because even after doing this for nearly 15 years, I still forget. And quite frankly, these days I write pretty much everything that I pass out in section directly in HTML. I still forget that at least once a week. So, create some markup. Bring it to our next workshop when we will talk about 2 primary things. One is, now that you've written these files, how do you get them on the web? And if you want to sign up with a web host, again, nearlyfreespeech.net is pretty cheap. You can get started for $0.25. But if you want to sign up with another host that better suits your needs, by golly, I'll do my best to help you with that as well. So start setting up a section website, section guidelines handout, a sort of a home page for the section website. Produce HTML versions of whatever documents you have the time and inclination to produce, but ideally have at least one document and a main page for the section website. Don't worry about how it looks. Indicate the actual textual structure of the document. Run them through the W3C's validator, and come talk to me if you have any problems. In terms of what's actually required in the medium term for how do you build a website, you probably have a blurb about who you are. Again, the business card model. It's generally thought to be a good idea to have some color somewhere on it. Of course, I haven't told you how to deal with color yet. One way to do that is to get an image of some kind on there. There are people who will argue that all websites should entirely be in black and white. I think that's a minority design position and not one that I agree with myself. So good pages to have might be web collections you built for students, your CV. If you don't want to encode your CV entirely in HTML, I don't blame you. And in fact, there's a good reason to hold off on that until section 3, because we'll be talking about making your CV meaningful in ways that meaningful to other machines and not just human viewable. But if you have a resume on LinkedIn, include a link to it. Links to you on other places to the web, especially if from those other places on the web you link back to your personal website, because this is one of the clues that search engines use in order to determine what is the most relevant document to return as a top hit. And, a personal info page of some kind, if you do it thoughtfully and tastefully. Again, mine badly needs updating. I'm using the same verbiage I was using when I came to grad school. I don't think I probably need to tell you there are a number of things that would probably be inappropriate to put on a personal info page. Pictures of people of diminutive stature on tricycles wearing nothing but a leather vest. Probably not a good idea, unless that's an explicit part of your scholarly interests. I suppose it could be. So, talking about scheduling and where we're going next. Next workshop will probably be week 5 or 6, and I'll ask for people to schedule collaboratively in a poll on that. But I'm thinking probably the best times, based on an informal verbal poll, are Monday and Friday afternoons and perhaps Wednesday morning.
You think more people will show up for this?
I think so, and especially if I let people schedule collaboratively, we will hopefully not overlap with another comma lecture.
Or another lecture.
Right. I don't mean to imply that comma is the only lecture I want to avoid overlapping with. It's just what happens today. So we'll talk about cascading style sheets and web hosting a little bit. Our third workshop will present some additional related topics, like making your content meaningful to search engines.
So should I bring something for our next session?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a couple of web pages designed for, along this line, bring them with you and I'll show you how to upload them, which is not hard, but you will need to know your username and password and various other things for whoever you sign up with your web hosting. I think what I'm probably going to do is have people who have things to upload come 15 or 20 minutes early. I'll give you a short speech about how to do it, and then I'll walk through and help people who are having trouble, because it's one of those things that setting it up initially can be kind of sticky, or at least require an additional pair of eyes sometimes. So yeah, and I'm thinking week 9 or week 10 for that.
Okay.
Questions?